am bodyguard trained. For those of you who are asking questions in their heads, no, this isn't a Leon-esque martial arts workshop that's about to take place, you'll be pleased to hear. There's normally about 3 responses that I get. The first one is confusion. How on earth did you get involved with that? The second is intimidation. Are you going to beat me up? Normally in social situations, which I clearly tell them I'm not able to do that. And the third is assumptions. So who are you protecting? People's wives and children? I find this assumption really interesting, and it's this assumption I'm going to talk to you about today. I didn't think about that assumption when I did my training. This assumption reminds me every day of how I've navigated the last 40 years being a woman and a female trained bodyguard. It makes me think about my own protectional qualities on a daily basis. It reminds me how I've come to realize that I had these protective qualities in the first place. I grew up in Sussex. I'm one of 4 children. My parents have been married for 52 years. Happy Father's Day, Dad. I was fiercely independent. I don't know who's grown up with brothers, but that was a lesson in protection in itself. I learnt a lot from growing up in what was actually a very protected childhood. But I learnt most from, actually, the teamwork dynamics of my parents. My mother was what we now call the CEO of the household. My father, the sort of dominant, traditional male role in our household, he was the one who was growing his business. He was the one that was traveling, and my mother was the one who was at home, raising, nurturing, protecting. So far, so normal. My father would often, very demonstratively, point to my mother and say, without this woman, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. Which is hugely inspirational growing up. I didn't realize it at the time, but I love you now, Dad. My younger brother finally left for university, and my mother thought that this was a really good time to also go to university. They didn't go to the same university because that would just be issues and Freshers Week, and yeah, she didn't celebrate that. So my father, who was retiring at that same time, he decided that this was a really good time to learn how to cook, which we were all delighted about. So they switched their roles around. But I didn't really realize this because the gender role reversal wasn't really the thing that I was concerned about growing up. We were protected. Meals were on the table. My mum's were always better than my father's. They passed this baton of the gender role between them. There was a sort of hunter-gatherer mixture that I grew up with. It didn't really apply to either my father or my mother that either one was more protective to me. I left home, I went to university, I studied French, not martial arts at all. I actually started my career as a personal assistant. And it was only actually 15 years into my career that I realized that I actually was protecting and gatekeeping on a daily basis. For anybody who's ever had an experience of being a PA or having a PA, they all know that they are the ones in charge. I worked for some of the world's wealthiest, most high-profile, influential, powerful, and increasingly exposed and at risk. So I worked with a lot of bodyguard teams during my career. One of the heads of the security that I worked with said to me, and this was 7 years ago, Brighty, have you thought about doing your bodyguard training? You boss us around enough, you might as well understand what it is we do. So off I went and did the training. I didn't even think about it. I didn't even think about who I was going to be protecting. I just, as a PA, was delighted to have been recognized and given some training, quite frankly. I nailed the training, even if I say so myself, 160 hours of what was not actually the sort of hard target combat training. A lot of it was practical, but a lot of it was theoretical. So I know a lot about data protection laws and the rights of citizens' arrests for anyone that wants to ask me later. The training, I loved the training, but what was most important to me was what was going to be the reaction of the guys when I came back. Took over back into my PA role with this new training. I was very excited. What actually happened was that I didn't know how useful I was potentially going to be within these protective roles, but the guys I worked with did. I am a woman. I am blendable, despite my height and obvious appearance. I am a woman. And increasingly, I was being asked to help with tasks where it wasn't just strength or force, because I'm pretty strong, but that wasn't what was needed. What was needed was actually to be invisible. What was also needed was my awesome PA skills that I'd honed over many, many years, my knowledge of London, my knowledge of where all the places were that we needed to go on task. I really helped the team with really smooth dynamics. I loved every minute of it. My career soon developed into what is now my business, providing security for families, male, female clients. Again, gender is irrelevant. What is relevant and the forefront of my mind every day is the best and most secure solution. According to the body that governs the security industry, the Security Industry Authority, I'm one of 755 women currently in the UK that hold this license. So I'm 5.4% of all license holders are women. But this statistic doesn't really tell the story of how useful women are and how there's been a massive increase in the demand for this invisible protection, for which women are the perfect candidates. I'm regularly asked to find female bodyguards for client tasks, and there are simply not enough of them. So how can I spread the word? How can I help empower other women to think of this as a career choice? How can I spread the word about invisible security? I decided to use those three things I mentioned: the confusion, the intimidation, and the assumption factor that most people have when they first talk to me about what I do, once the questions are over. I decided to turn it on its head and use those unedited reactions that most people have when I say what I do that aren't in the industry. For most people who aren't in the industry, this is the first time they may have come across a woman in this role. They may not be used to the very mere fact that bodyguards operate, exist, and work with clients all over London and the world on a daily basis. I now start to use this reaction as a barometer and try to put people at ease, try to explain what it is that the role is, what you actually do. And I also try to gain trust, and this is most important for me in my daily work. It reminds me of an example of a family that I worked with when I'd first started my business. They'd come to me, a wealthy international couple. Their children were just at the sort of drinking age. For anyone with children around that sort of age, terrifying. They were terrified of their children going out. There were certain risks associated to their profile, which meant they wanted some solutions as to how to deal with this. So we were there to provide these solutions. When I went to talk to the parents, I sat down. Before I'd even started talking, the father said, "Gosh, you must be very, very strong. to which we then started talking about martial arts training. The mother then said, gosh, I don't think I'm strong enough to do what you do. The paternal strength, the maternal instinctive reaction. And at that moment, I'd realized the enormity of my task and my work in protecting the most important people in their lives. Big responsibility. I set about creating a task, and I explained to them I was going to use male and female operatives for this task. We delivered this solution to the parents, and we delivered the project, and it went very successfully. The children still never know, by the way, that this happened, that they were being protected, without their knowledge. God help if my parents had done that for me when I was younger. I can only say thank you that they didn't. The invisible protection, there, we see at its best. So, for me, the solution in my daily work is to deconflict, to show protection less as brute strength and force, and more in terms of intelligence, preparation, and invisibility. This helps me change the perception of the industry and the work in those that I meet. I want to share with you some of the other examples that I use also to deconflict, to get people into my trust, and anecdotally, particularly when I'm out talking to young people, and particularly young women, about what I do. Firstly is the example of the lioness. 90% of lionesses are the true hunters. They go out, they hunt, they bring back the bacon, as it were, and the men are left to protect the pride and the young. Again, I use the example in contrast to my upbringing, where this interchangeable, the gender roles being interchangeable, was totally normal to me. It reminded me of my parents' teamwork dynamics. The teamwork dynamics that I use every day in my work. I also use the example of invisible protection through time. I'm fascinated by World War II history, and particularly the role of women within it. Those women in the Special Operations Executive, 55 of them to be precise, who were used to parachute in behind enemy lines, to extract information from the enemy, to blend in, to hide weaponry in their dresses and skirts, because no one would think to check them, right? One such agent, Violet Szabo, hugely inspires me, and I use her as an example every day. Here we have a picture of Violet's 4-year-old daughter accepting the George Cross on Violet's behalf. Violet had actually perished in one of the concentration camps. For me, a brilliantly inspiring image. I urge any of you to look at the other stories, the other 54 women. They're incredible. She was only 5'3", diminutive in height, yet hugely powerful with what she could achieve. I then like to bring examples from my own industry, because again, a lot of people have never seen particularly female operatives in action. I like using current examples. Here we have one of our ambassadors, the Duchess of Cornwall. She uses a lot of female operatives, and I'm hugely inspired by this operative you see here, who we'll call SP. This highlights the role of invisibility quite well, I think. Interestingly, and there's a special prize if someone can find an image of women on the internet. It's really hard to find any high-profile people with women lurking in the background. A special prize if anyone finds one to send to me, which shows their invisibility. Finally, I also use this image. I was in the Middle East recently, and I was preparing for a talk to some Emirati women about protection. And one of them is a great friend of mine, and I showed her my presentation before I started talking. I was really excited. And I said, look, I'm using this image. Isn't this empowering? And she said, this is totally normal. What are you talking about? So after a quick rewrite and edit, of course, women have long been using a protective role in the Middle East. For me, this image I always still use because 3 of them have actually conquered Mount Everest, which is something that I personally think is quite inspiring. So, in conclusion, I use these examples because I want to become a mouthpiece for my industry. I want to, every day, help turn the confusion into some sort of clarity by answering anybody's questions about the industry. I want to help to change that intimidation, turn it into empowerment. And most of all, I want to challenge the assumptions, change mindsets, help them grow. In the future, let us look at invisible security and invisible protection as something that can always help us to learn and grow. Thank you.